What's up everyone, I'm back with more Vintage 30 content, and today I want to show you some of the oddball Vintage 30s. A short while ago I made a video about a massive Celestion Vintage 30 speaker shootout in which I attempted to tackle some of the common myths about the Vintage 30. If you haven't seen that video yet, you might want to check that out first, I'll link it in the description. Anyway, originally I had the exotics or oddball Vintage 30s in that video too, but in the grand scheme of things, they represent somewhat of a side plot. And also I was getting pretty nervous about the video's length at that stage, so I decided to drop them. But to my great surprise and absolute delight, that video has done way better than anything I've done before that. So here's a little bonus video with the exotic Vintage 30s. Here are the speakers I'm going to show you. The 8 ohm black frame Vintage 30 from the early 90s, the Bad Cat amplification OEM Vintage 30, the Hughes and Kettner OEM Vintage 30s with 1777 cones from the early 2000s in 8 and 16 ohms, the Marshall Vintage 30MF from the Mode 4 cabs, the Tube Amp Doctor 25th anniversary speaker, which I believe to be a V30 in disguise, and this very early weird speaker with Vintage 30 cosmetics but the Marshall product code. These speakers were all part of my original 50 plus speaker shootout video, so they got the same treatment. Every speaker was placed in an ISO cab with the same orientation with a single SM57 in a fixed position, and then got some riffs reamped through them using an EVH 5153 and Room EQ Wizard sweeps to create frequency response graphs. You can check out the details of the setup in the other video if you're interested and haven't seen it yet. What I want to do now is show you each speaker, say a few words about them, and compare them to regular Vintage 30s using the reamp tracks and in some cases the frequency response graphs. Let's get into it. Okay, let's start with this. Not many people know this, but Bad Cat Amplification used to have their own OEM Celestion Vintage 30. I believe they still have Celestion OEM speakers, but they're not based on Vintage 30s anymore. I think these aren't being made anymore. What I find particularly interesting about these speakers is that unlike the Marshall or the Mesa Boogie OEM Vintage 30s, these have obvious visual differences in the parts that generate the tone. Take a close look at the outside of the cone. Notice that the suspension on these is matte instead of glossy as it usually is. I believe that glossy stuff on the suspension is doping that these don't have. The dust caps also look a bit different. They have a kind of a greenish hue instead of the usual black. I don't know if doping usually goes on the dust caps, but these look different anyway. That's one difference they have. Let's compare them to some regular Vintage 30s. I have two of these. One is from 2008 and the other is from 2014. Both of them are 8 ohms, and I believe there never was a 16 ohm version of this speaker. Now sadly I don't have any other 8 ohm speakers from around 2014, but I do have a couple of them from 2008. One of them is a regular Vintage 30, T3903, and two of them are the Mesa Boogie OEM versions. Let's check them out. I've got the same Reaper project setup as in the previous video. I have two tracks here that I want to compare. I can switch back and forth of them seamlessly using this plugin called Nugent Audio AB Assist. I have an instance of Voxengo Span Plus loaded up here that shows us live FFTs of the tracks. And if I want to hone in on a few frequencies like just the mids or just the high ends, I can use this instance of Brainworks BX Clean Sweep Pro. Let's compare the Bad Cat to the stock Vintage 30. A is the Bad Cat and B is the stock Vintage 30. Okay, let's compare the Bad Cat to the first Mesa Boogie Vintage 30. A is the Bad Cat speaker and B is the Mesa Boogie speaker. Okay, second Mesa Boogie speaker. A is the Bad Cat, B is the Mesa Boogie speaker. Okay, it's definitely a Vintage 30, same ballpark, but they do sound a little different here. And just listening to the tracks, I find it quite difficult to pinpoint that. But luckily we have our Room EQ Wizard sweeps. And I created this graph here that has all 4 of the 2008 speakers in it. Purple is the regular Vintage 30, orange and pink are the Mesa speakers, and red is the Bad Cat speaker. And notice that the Bad Cat speaker generates slightly lower sound pressure levels in the mids, and there's a big difference here at about 1.5K. And the slightly lower sound pressure levels in the low mids, that could be That could just be tolerances, but compare the 2008 to the 2014 Bad Cat speaker. They are pretty close here. The 2014 speaker generates slightly higher sound pressure levels here, but it has a very similar characteristic here at about 1.5K. The 2014 one is the purple line, and the 2008 is the orange line. Apart from that, these are pretty close to each other, considering that they are 6 years apart. Let's take a quick A-B listen between the 2008 and 2014. The 2008 speaker is A, and the 2014 speaker is B. Those are pretty close to each other, even considering the regular production tolerances. Some more not well-known OEM vintage 30s are the 1777 cone vintage 30s made for Hughes and Kettner in the early 2000s. I've not been able to find out an awful lot about these other than the fact that they were made for Hughes and Kettner, came in 8 and 16 ohms, and were roughly made in the early 2000s. I don't exactly know when Celestion started making these or when they stopped making these. All I know is that my 16 ohm pair was made in the UK in the year 2001, while my 8 ohm pair was made in China in the year 2003. All the other examples of these speakers I've seen for sale were made in between these years. If you know more about these speakers, please contact me. I'd really like to know some more. Anyway, these stick out amongst the vintage 30s because they're the only ones to not have the 444 bass cones. Instead, these use the 1777 cone, which is Celestion's lead cone, which they use on the K100s, for example, or on the T75s, if I'm correct. Also, these appear to be made with different gaskets. They don't have that usual black plastic foam gasket that Celestion Vintage 30s have, but use gaskets that appear to be made of paper or cardboard. They look to me like the same gaskets Celestion use on their Alnico speakers, like the Alnico Blues or the Alnico Creams. Let's compare them to some regular vintage 30s from their eras. Let's look at the 16 ohm pair first. Let's compare how they sound to each other. Okay, one of them is quite a lot brighter. Let's take a quick look at the Voxengo Span Plus graphs while they're playing. Look at this area here. Big difference. Okay, I'm going to use speaker 15, which is A in this example, to compare to the others. Let's compare this 2001 1777 cone vintage 30 to a regular 16 ohm vintage 30 from the year 2000. A is the 1777 cone and B is the regular vintage 30. Okay, let's compare the first 1777 cone vintage 30 to a regular vintage 30 from 2002. Before we talk about these, let's check out the 8 ohms next. First, to each other. Okay, as usual, the difference seems to be in the high end. Let's compare one of them to a regular vintage 30 from the same year, 2003. A is the 1777 cone vintage 30 and B is the regular 444 cone vintage 30, the T3903. The difference between the 1777 Cohen Vintage 30s and the regular Vintage 30s is not as big as I thought it would be. I think Nolly said in his video on Christian Kohle's channel in the V30 Masterclass that these were some of the worst Vintage 30s he's heard, and that's pretty much the only thing I disagree on him with. I don't think they sound bad. I think the 16 ohm version actually sounds pretty cool. The 8 ohm 1777 Cohen speakers were a bit brighter in the 5 to 6K region, so not as smooth, but not by far not the worst Vintage 30s I've heard. But I guess that's all preference. Let's move on. This is a black frame Vintage 30 from 1992. The black frame Vintage 30 is probably the most mysterious Vintage 30 to me. I know they were made in the very early 90s and that there was an 8 and a 16 ohm model. And in the last 5 years of collecting Vintage 30s, I've seen about half a dozen 8 ohm black frames for sale, but none of the 16 ohms. But I've seen one in a Facebook group once. People often refer to these as mezzo speakers. BygoneTones.com has a huge index of all the Celestion product codes or model numbers, and for both the 16 and the 8 ohm version, it lists Meza in the brief description column, implying that these are Meza Boogie OEM speakers. However, I don't believe that to be entirely accurate. For one thing, I've never seen a Meza Boogie cab with black frame speakers in it, and secondly, whenever one of these was for sale, I asked the seller what cab the speaker came from, and if the seller even knew, these were either from a Hughes and Kettner cab or from a Johnson cab. Always. Never a Meza Boogie cab. Also, recently I saw a post in an Engel Facebook group where a guy had 4 of these in his early 90s Engel cab. So if these were sold to Meza Boogie, I don't think they were sold exclusively to Meza Boogie. This is not a Meza Boogie OEM speaker. I'm pretty sure of it. I have 2 8 ohm black frame speakers from 1992 here. Let's compare them to some other late 80s, early 90s speakers. As usual, let's compare them to each other first. As expected, noticeably different. The production tolerances seem to have been bigger in the early 90s and late 80s. Let's compare one of these 1992 black frames to a regular 8 ohm Vintage 30 from 1991. A is the black frame, B is the regular Vintage 30. Okay, the black frame is noticeably louder. Let's bump the regular speaker up, say 2 dB. Let's see how that sounds. Okay, let's compare the black frame from 1992 to one of the original Celestion Vintage 30s from 1986. A is the 92 black frame and B is the 86 Vintage 30. Yikes, the black frame is much louder. Let's give the 86 about 2.5 dBs to compensate. Well, first of all, there's a noticeable variance between the two speakers, as it seems to be the case with most of my late 80s and early 90s speakers. But these are also noticeably louder and brighter than the other speakers I have from that era. And it's hard to say if that is a design thing, meaning if the black frame speaker has a different design than the regular Vintage 30, or if this is just a 1992 thing. Maybe the Cohens were a certain way in 1992 that made them sound louder. I don't really know. Maybe I need to find another speaker from 1992 to compare that to. Little unsatisfying, but that's all I can do for now. This is a Vintage 30MF. Marshall made these 16 ohm speakers for Marshall in the mid to late 2000s for their Mode 4 cabs, specifically the MF280 cabs. There's a bit of a hype about this speaker online. People generally seem to like it a lot, and I read a lot that it's supposed to sound closer to the Mesa Boogie Vintage 30 than the regular Vintage 30, but as you might know, I wasn't able to find a distinctive difference between the Mesa and the regular Vintage 30 in my previous videos, so I'm not really sure what to expect right now. All I can say is that my pair of Vintage 30MFs was made in the UK in 2002. The only thing that really sticks out visually about these is the unusually flat dust cap here. None of my other Vintage 30s have a dust cap like this, and for a while there I was worried that these might have been reconed, but the batch codes on the cones pretty much fit the other Vintage 30s from that era, the early 2000s that I have. And I also checked in with a friend who has a quad of V30MFs made in China in the year 2007, and they also seem to have that flat dust cap, so let's see what that's about. Let's see how these compare to normal 16 ohm Vintage 30s from the same year, which is 2002. Let's find out how they compare to each other first. Yeah, one seems to have more high end, but that's about it. Let's compare one of them to a 16 ohm speaker from the year 2000. Let's compare the other one to a regular one from the year 2000. Okay, if I didn't mention it, A is the Vintage 30MF always in this example. So let's compare a Vintage 30MF from the year 2002 to a regular Vintage 30 from the year 2002. Okay, let's compare the other Vintage 30MF to that same 2002 speaker. Sound like Vintage 30s to me. Sound good. Next. A while ago, Marshall brought out a signature rig for Dave Mustaine. That rig consisted of a regular JVM 410H in faux carbon fiber toe links and two very interesting looking cabs. The cabs had metal grates instead of griddle cloth, and they were loaded with 16 ohm Dave Mustaine Vintage 30s. According to Bygone Tones and some photos I was able to find on rigtalk.com, these speakers had the product code T5731B. And apart from the 16 ohm black frame Vintage 30s, these are the only Vintage 30s I know of that I wasn't able to get my hands on. I've never seen one for sale, and the cabs were either too far away or too expensive for me. But I have this. This is a speaker that German tube and amp part retailer Tube Amp Doctor brought out for their 25th anniversary in 2018. Now check out the product code. T5731B, the same product code as the Dave Mustaine Vintage 30. Now this is the part where I'm going to speculate wildly, so keep in mind the following could turn out to be absolute bullshit. I believe these speakers could be relabeled Dave Mustaine Vintage 30s. They use the same product code and they have the same silver basket that the Marshall G12 Vintages have. These here are limited to 180 pieces. And that seems like a weird number to me. Why 180 if it's Tube Amp Doctor's 25th anniversary? I would have gone for 250. Maybe Celestion didn't have any more of these. I also want to point out that these speakers were made in 2004, 4 years before Tube Amp Doctor's 25th anniversary. Well, that's my conspiracy theory anyway, but that all goes out the window if these sound nothing like Vintage 30s. Unfortunately, I don't have any 16 ohmers from 2014, so I'm going to have to compare them to 16 ohm Vintage 30s from 2019 and 2008. But let's check that out anyway. All right, first of all, let's compare it to a regular 16 ohm vintage 30 from 2019. A is the tube amp Doctor speaker and B is the regular vintage 30. Okay, there's a difference in the high mids there and in the region over 10K. Let's compare the tube amp Doctor speaker to a regular vintage 30 and 16 ohms from 2008. A is the tube amp Doctor speaker, B is the vintage 30. The tube amp Doctor speaker is slightly boosted in the 2.5 to 3.5 kilohertz area. Apart from that, seems like a vintage 30 to me. By the way, tube amp Doctor is still selling these. I'll link them in the description. I'm not affiliated with tube amp Doctor in any way. I just think they're cool, and if you want one, I think you should be able to get one. Also, if you're in Europe, this might be interesting because tube amp Doctors sell these for 125 euros, at least last time I checked they did, which is less than you'd typically pay for a vintage 30. So if you want one, check it out. All right, the last oddball speaker I have here is the oldest speaker I own, which is a vintage 30 from 1986, from February 1986 to be precise. And what makes this interesting is 1986 was the year that the vintage 30 was released. However, Celestion made the speaker for Marshall as the Marshall G12 Vintage a year before that, I think for the Silver Jubilee cabs, but that could be wrong, don't quote me on that. What makes this speaker interesting to me is that it has the Celestion aesthetics, it's got the Celestion speaker label, but it's got the Marshall product code. So I believe this to be one of the very first vintage 30s that Celestion made. They probably just came up with a different product code later, or I don't know, Nigel might have screwed up at the factory that day. I want to compare it to my other 86 vintage 30s. I don't expect to learn a lot from this, but I still want to find out. I think the speaker is cool, so it's my video. I'm just going to do it. A is the mystery Marshall type code vintage 30, and B is the first regular vintage 30 I have from 86. Okay, let's see how it sounds compared to the other one from 86. A is the one with the Marshall type code. B is the one with the Celestion type code. Okay, it sounds close to one of them to my ears and pretty drastically different to the other, but that just seems to be the production tolerances of the late 80s and early 90s. That's all I've got for now. That's all my weird vintage 30s, but that's by far not all the weird vintage 30s that Celestion made over the years. For example, there was a 4 ohm vintage 30 in the early 90s and late 80s, I believe. I've only seen a few of them, last on eBay, where I sadly and regrettably chickened out of the auction. But the weirdest and most interesting vintage 30 to me is a 5.3 ohm vintage 30 that I believe was made for a specific Trace Elliot cab. Trace Elliot made a 3x12 guitar cab for a while where all the speakers were angled to reduce that beam of death effect. And I believe this cab had 3 5.3 ohm vintage 30s wired up in series to create an overall load of 16 ohms. If you like this Nerdfest, I'd appreciate it if you could let me know by either leaving a comment down there or clicking the like button, or doing both in fact. I've got a few more Vintage 30 videos planned here. In the next Vintage 30 video, I'm going to take a deep dive on the dust cap issue. In the first Vintage 30 video, I wasn't able to find a distinctive difference between the dust caps used, but that was the biggest difference between the speakers. Some of them were soft, some of them were hard, some of them were brittle, but I couldn't find out what if that had any influence on the character of the speakers. So in this following video, I'm going to remove a dust cap from a speaker entirely and see if that makes a difference, and then glue on dust caps made of different materials to see how that affects the tone, if at all. And after that, I've got a deep dive on the new Vintage 30s planned. In the first video, I had two brand new Vintage 30s and they sounded pretty different from each other. And much later on, I found a clue why that might be. I missed something, which made me buy 4 more new Vintage 30s. We're going to take a closer look at that. And probably much later this year, I'm going to try to record speaker break-in, but that is a test that'll take me a bit longer. I'm going to have to give one of the new speakers a proper thrashing to see if I can measure the effect these long playtimes have. Is speaker break-in real? I'm going to try to find out. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!